So good evening and welcome back. So this is an attempt to nightly cover a number of issues that are very critical and continue to dominate the discussion of the American Muslim community. So today what I wanted to cover is Islamophobia, latent Islamophobia, manifest Islamophobia, and the limits that are imposed on Muslim political participation, which we see taking place through the Democratic National Convention, even though that there are statements that are there articulated to inclusivity and embracing diversity, but yet we're still seeing the limitations that are imposed on Muslims, in particular the attack that has been directed at Linda Sarsour and her participation within the various elements within the Democratic National Convention. And in here is how to understand Islamophobia. When we often think of Islamophobia, we only often think of the most possible pernicious part of it, either a violent attack, somebody confronting a Muslim in public space, whether it's in a shopping place or in areas, open areas, harassment, employment, discrimination. All these are areas that we could account for relative to what Islamophobia is all about. Actually, if we want to map out the various types of Islamophobia or the various manifestation of Islamophobia, we could say Islamophobia that is exclusion from society, verbal discrimination statements, and even representation that looks at the Muslim as in a different light and a different notion. Discrimination in employment, in housing, even in inclusion in various parts of civil society. And then we could speak about violence, which often we maybe focus on and look on as a real representation of Islamophobia. But it's a full spectrum of elements that really racist and discriminatory discourse taking place. So let me first deal with the issue of latent Islamophobia. And this concept of latent Islamophobia is really built upon the concept that was developed by Edward Said in Orientalism, in speaking of latent Orientalism. And this latent Orientalism, it is that those ideas, those notions that are firmly established in the mind and are deposited in the mind over an accumulative process. And therefore, latent Orientalism would be all the different articulation of Orientalist imagery, Orientalism in popular media in terms of movies, Orientalism that are depicted in the art, cartoons, and so on. These are the repertoire that constructs the latent Orientalism. And from latent Orientalism, we get into manifest Orientalism. And this is where the deposited firm understandings that are constructed perceptions make their way into policy and policy articulation. So in essence, the latent feeds into and work to shape the manifest Orientalism. Now, I think my dear friend Robert Bashara also have extended and made a comparison between Edward Said's work on manifest Orientalism and latent Orientalism to speak about Freud's notion of the subconscious and how it affects the conscious. So he actually, in his PhD thesis, that's also is being articulated and come out as a book, draws out the work of Said and makes the link, the very important link in terms of the scholarship and the grounding of scholarship. And then Bashara takes it forward to actually look at what he considered to be critical studies that looks at psychology from a critical lens that brings in Edward Said and brings in Islamophobia as well in his work. So in this sense, when we speak about latent Islamophobia, I would argue that the society in the Western world, and I also would extend it to the Muslim world as in other parts, have all internalized latent Islamophobia. And this has come as a direct result of the massive consumption and the massive articulation that shaped the social imaginary in the society relative to the Muslim subject. So if you open the news, the Muslim subject in overwhelming, it's almost 300 times as often negative representation of the Muslim subject that is there. So that produces a wide and deep reservoir of latent Islamophobic content. If we look at the area of artistic expression in relations to the movies, if we think about the various TV series, 24 Hours, Homeland, and even in comedy where the Muslim subject is brought in, and I will speak about it a little bit later, that all of this, often the Muslim subject is either represented negatively, which is the dominant, or sometimes even if it's represented as within the realm of positive representation, it is only represented to break and to be an informant or a person that embraces the notion of patriotic expression to try to deal with the bad Muslim or the bad subject. So even though it's the inclusion of that subject is deemed to be in the positive end, it is actually a positive that is wrapped around the negative. The net result, it begins to affirm the negative characteristics and the negative representation rather than undoing it. And furthermore, when we speak about comedy and the use of humor, which is understandable that one way to try to break the prejudices is to use humor. But in here, the humor is also to be articulated in order to actually humanize the self or humanize the person and humanize the society to the gaze of another that is laughing and in a sense laughing at the subject or with the subject, and rather than actually erasing or removing the stereotypes, removing the Islamophobia, it actually ends up often affirming it and becoming far more permanent within this Islamophobic social imaginary. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not here critiquing Muslim comedians and their engagement in comedy. I think it's very important for any community to be able to laugh. And I do think that Muslims are human. So if you tickle them, they do laugh. And I encourage them to laugh. And I'm a person that always enjoy laughter and enjoy comedy. But one has to think about the theoretical aspect of how comedy often is being theorized as an area where stereotypical representation are to be challenged by means of laughter, I would say that the literature and the research in this is still often does not lend its hand to it being the fact. Now, there is a notion of actually bringing more representation in this sense. So it's not only the singular laughter, but also the multiplicity and the complexity of characters that might be brought into representation that might have an effect over a prolonged period of time. But a one-off or a single Muslim character that can help us laugh cannot undo the mountains of negative representation. And in here, again, I'm definitely in developing the concept of latent Islamophobia, definitely I am borrowing and using the scope of the work of Edward Said. His work on covering Islam is a very important book that needs to be read, but also Jack Shaheen, Real Bad Arabs, and the representation of Arabs in Hollywood. And he evaluated over 1,000 movies in order to do that. My point in here is that we have a heavy swampland of latent Islamophobia that if you scratch any of the political elites in the United States, in the West, and I would argue also in the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, they actually have also internalized the negative representation of Islam and Muslims, and they actually been educated on the Eurocentric worldview. So likewise, you have that latent Islamophobic discourse in the Muslim world as well. This gets us into political participation of Muslims at this particular time is really running head on against or within this firmly established Islamophobic social imaginary, latent Islamophobia that is there. And it's not far behind in relations to this. So the attack on Linda Sarsour is coming. One is on the Palestine issue for sure, because Linda Sarsour being proud Palestinian, Muslim, outspoken, and ready to defend her position. But more importantly is that her ability to break into the social political space is running against the gatekeepers who continue to try to regulate and want to maintain firm this latent Islamophobic social imaginary in there. Now let me go a little bit step forward, further in this. The overwhelming funding and the infrastructure for Islamophobia in the United States can be traced to certain segments of the pro-Israel Zionist movement in the United States. It is not surprising that some of the key figures in the Islamophobia industry, Pamela Geller, Daniel Pipes, and if you think about Frank Gaffney and Stephen Emerson, and if you think about the organizational infrastructure that they have in place and supported that infrastructure, there seems to be the gatekeepers for maintaining and consolidating the Islamophobic social imaginary and also firming up the latent Islamophobia are beholden and attempting to use Islamophobia as a way to continue the United States' unconditional support to Israel. So in this sense, I could see that those who constantly are using Islamophobic daggers to try to discipline the Muslim subject in the civil, social space and political space are using it for a very strategic outcome, which is to make sure that Israel's position in both political parties as well as in the broader American society is maintained and unchallenged, which also raises the question about the alliances that we see forming between certain segments of the pro-Israel Zionist movement in the United States and some of the right-wing nationalist movement that are fascist in nature, both in the United States, in Europe, and for sure the alliances that being forged with India in terms of Narendra Modi and the PGP party. In here, as long as the contestation, demonization, and the shaping of latent Islamophobic discourse can serve a strategic interest, then that is part and parcel of the continued targeting and demonization of any Muslim subject that emerges into the landscape and begins to articulate what I consider to be the primary opinions and perspectives that are held by the American Muslim community. So this is again becomes a very important element to understand the strategy that is being deployed vis-a-vis latent Islamophobia and the attack that are being pursued. So that demonization, that framing of Muslims leads to the articulation of the policy, which is the manifest Islamophobia. So there is a relationship between the latent and the manifest. Often we tend to actually make a mistake that what we are in challenging Islamophobia, we tend to only focus often at the manifest part of it, rather than dealing with the latent production and affirming of Islamophobic content and imaginary in the society. And I think that has to be a simultaneous engagement and as much investment in terms of effort, resources, know-how, and infrastructure to challenge the latent Islamophobia in order to actually begin to challenge the manifest Islamophobia in a systematic way. So Muslims, I said last night, are unequal citizens because they are facing a mountain of Islamophobic structures, social imaginaries, institutional framework that have externalized and otherized the Muslim experience in itself. And in here, when I'm using the term Muslim or Islam, I am not resorting to any notion of trying to construct an identity politics or resorting to these notions. I understand the discussions and the framing, but in here, Muslims have been otherized, have faced the brunt of Islamophobic discourses. And we could also go a longer duration, almost the 20th century, can be offered as exhibit A, B, and C in both Orientalism that had a distinctive Islamophobic characteristics to it, and all the way up to the present in relations to Islamophobia. I want to jump a little bit in terms of the intensification of latent Islamophobia actually emerges, as I said, with the campaign, with President Obama's campaign in 2008, which upon the actually witnessing the campaign, I began the work to set up the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project, because the phenomena was completely distinct and different to what was being experienced before. Now, for sure, those who use Islamophobia to target Obama as being a supposed closet Muslim, really they were not comfortable with him being a black person running for the presidency and winning the presidency. But the social acceptability of using the N-word on Obama and using anti-black racism publicly in the discourse was still had some limitation to it. So I make the argument, and I continue to insist, that they use the M word, meaning Muslim, as a substitute for the N word, which made it possible for all those that are claiming protection and defense of the American society to feel comfortable and at ease to use the M word, to use anti-Sharia legislation, to mobilize in social and political spaces, to rally within the media and media context the anti-Muslim sentiment. And as racism toward Muslims became acceptable in the public sphere, those who started this campaign felt emboldened to come back and begin to use the N-word publicly and to feel that they are actually entitled to use the N-word to defend the society. And here the society, or to defend the people, meaning white people, feeling comfortable to use the N-word, so much so now that we have the rising tide of white nationalism, racism, white supremacy, that also tugged the campaign around Islamophobia to come back into respectability. And the president himself not only nods, but actually tweets and reposts some of the white supremacist, white nationalist material. And just because they support him, he feels at ease. But that discourse begins in earnest around the 2008 campaign of Obama. Now, one can actually begin to assert and put forth the idea that this wide backlash began immediately after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Immigration Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act, 64-65. But it took until the 2008 for it to actually become so emboldened and ride, you could possibly here laugh with me, ride the Islamophobia camel in order to come back into an attitude of being emboldened to use the N-word in defense of the society. And now we're at a point where this has become the norm in relations to how the society is framed. So in this sense, Islamophobia becomes part and parcel of reimagining a historical past using the Muslim subject as a way to frame racial discourses within the society. Again, I want to caution individuals that are listening to me. I am by no means saying that racism only begins with 2008 campaign of Obama and the anti-Muslim discourse is the beginning of racism. Racism is wired into this country from its foundation. It's wired into the settler colonialism. It's wired into the genocide of the native population. It's wired into the enslavement of Africans. It's wired into the Monroe Doctrine of the Western Hemisphere. So in this sense, one has to be cognizant of the history of racism and racial discrimination in this country, whether it be against the Chinese with the Chinese Exclusionary Act, the discrimination and racism on the Latino population, whether it be before the Second World War and after the Second World War, the Japanese internment, the targeting and discrimination against Vietnamese. So again, there's a long history. But what I'm making an argument for and a thesis that the Islamophobia intensification and the emergence of a consolidated latent Islamophobic discourse begins to take shape around the election of Obama in 2008 campaign and really takes on a different trajectory. And now we have almost 115 plus organizations, and the financial support and the infrastructure behind many of these organizations, I maintain, comes from the pro-Israel and a segment of the US-based Zionist movement that uses Islamophobia as a way of pushing Muslims, Arabs, and their allies outside of the political arena so far in order to maintain the unconditional support for Israel intact. So that's the strategy in there. And we have, again, evidence from tax returns, especially from various Jewish federations, whether it's San Francisco Jewish Federation, Chicago, or New York, where funding is not only directed at some of these pernicious Islamophobic outfits, like the Daniel Pipe outfit, the Stephen Emerson's outfit, David Horowitz's outfit, Memory outfit, but also some of the Islamophobes from Europe, like Geert Wilder in the Netherlands, who actually was funded by the San Francisco Jewish Federation, or the Tea Party Patriots, being funded by the San Francisco Jewish Federation. These are not only that they're Islamophobes, but they're actually often are just a step away from fascism itself, which raises the question, is the enemy of my enemy my friend, or is it a marriage of convenience? And where are the principles, ethical and moral principles that actually guides the community? So in here, as we push back against the targeting of Linda Sarsour in relations to the Islamophobia and attempt to silence her, as well as anyone that comes to speak on Palestine and Muslim issues, we need to be very clear, why is it Islamophobic? Because at the core of participation in society is the ability to speak, and to speak the issues that are critical to your own community, and to be individuals that want transformation to occur. The fact that some participants and some who are part of the Democratic Party, in particular segments of the Zionist movement, that they feel that not only that they want to occupy and to construct apartheid in Palestine, to exclude Palestinians, to transfer them, to annex, but they also want to annex Palestinian mouths. They want to actually silence individuals from speaking, which for me is also an indication that the pro-Israel supporters in the United States and other parts of Europe, they really have lost the debate itself. And the only way for them to actually have a say or to have their day is by muzzling the statements that are coming out of the mouth of Palestinians, and then to insidiously use the term to actually call Palestinians and pro-Palestinians that they are committing acts of discrimination or anti-Semitism. And this raises the question again, if you're actually supporting somebody like Geert Wilder, if you're supporting Tea Party patriots, if you are welcoming Marie Le Pen from France, or Orban from Hungary, or every other right-wing nationalist, racist, neo-Nazi political figures in Europe, this raises the question about really how we define and how do we engage in countering racism as it rears its ugly head, whether it's in Europe or the United States. So this is a question, actually, I put it both to those who speak on behalf of Zionism and those who speak within the broader American society, is that if supporters of Israel thinking that Islamophobia, an alliance with right-wing nationalists and right-wing parties in Europe, or nationalists and conspiracy theorists here in the United States, is the way to protect Israel, I would say I'll give them the history as an exhibit that these are individuals and parties and groups that are as much antagonistic, hateful, bigoted toward Muslims, as much as their history of bigotry and anti-Semitism is well established. And therefore, we have to challenge both in challenging Islamophobia, but also challenging the leadership and the mainstream Jewish organizations that think defending Israel goes through the path of creating alliances with organizations, groups, and individuals that are beyond the pale. So we have a lot of work ahead of us to do, but it's not possible, or it's not even the path forward to say that we are target any Palestinian or pro-Palestinian that comes out, and the only way for you to be included as Muslims is to be mute, deaf, and blind, and we only want a type of huggable Muslim that does not actually speak, or if you pinch them, they're not going to say ouch, and you slap them and they will say thank you for the slap. Those days of thinking that this is the type of Muslim political participation is over. It might have been at an older period where predominantly Muslim immigrants who came in here from oppressive background, that they did not want to rock the boat. They were comfortable of taking photo ops and basically not actually challenging the status quo. We're dealing with a second, third, and fourth generations of Arab Muslims, Palestinians, that are no longer accepting the old type of political engagement that is there, and they are assertive of their right not only to speak on Palestine, but to speak on a variety of issues, which is also brings us to, in particular, the work of Linda Sarsour. And I know there are some Muslims that are often running to the forefront to critique on various Islamic issues in here and there, and those can be taken and we could discuss those. But let's be very clear. Linda Sarsour is being attacked not because of her certain positions relative to Islam or Islamic law. She is being attacked specifically because she have taken on and spoke in support of PDS, in support of the Palestinians, in support of Black Lives Matter, mobilizing to come out and organize with the Black activists, Latino activists, and working with the with the pro-immigrant or pro-immigrant coalitions to defend the rights of immigrants. She was one of the leaders of the women's movement or the women's protest immediately in 2017 after the election of Trump. And even her participation in the Women's March was actually also something to be to speak about, because Zionism intervened, Israel intervened at that moment also to wanting to push Linda Sarsour out, which means also, and here's the major point of contradiction, it seems that, that there has to be a limits on what a women's movement can articulate, and the limits is Israel is the limits. So you could actually engage in all types of issues and all types of discussions, but don't touch Israel and don't allow Palestinians to the stage. And we have seen the type of divisions, the type of mobilization that have taken place to limit and to try to essentially almost divide the movement on the issue of Zionism, which is a settler colonial idea. Israel is a settler colonial state. I'm sorry, if you don't like it, then go and find a therapist that could actually get you a 10-step program or 12-step program to undo the fact that you think that everybody think of Israel in the same way that you do. But in here, exclusion is the strategy. If you are unable to argue the point, then you make the messenger, you make the person who's articulating the point the issue, and you begin to attack systematically Linda Sarsour and anyone that is actually advocating this perspective. So for Muslims, Arab, Palestinians, and our allies, this is the moment to actually make it clear. If you want our participation, actually, I'm sorry to say if you want, it's none of your business whether you want or not. We are participating. If you don't like it, that's your problem. Find you another party. And we might find another party ourselves. Again, we are exercising our full democratic rights. and to say free Palestine is our democratic right, support BDS is our democratic right to boycott is our democratic rights, the right to call for divestment is our democratic rights, and these are rights we're going to take. If you don't like it, again, the door is wide open, and you could continue to have your what you call your Zionist cake and eat it within segments of the Democratic Party, or you might go and have what you call the Las Vegas gathering that Sheldon Adelson and Haim Saban held in order to deal with how to counter the PDS and the pro-Palestine movement. So again, it's not that you don't have assets that you haven't brought forth, you have, and not only that, but you also targeted segments of the progressive Jewish community, whether it's Jewish Voice for Peace, Bend the Arc, or if not now, all these organizations, the International Anti-Zionist Jewish Network, all these also you have targeted because either you are targeting the Palestinians who speak as being anti-Semitic and they're discriminatory, or the increasing segment of the Jewish community, especially the young ones that are coming and having solidarity and building a future horizon collectively, you call them a self-hating Jew. And these are, again, it's very, very what you call easy tactics. These are understandable tactics. You demonize the individual, you make them radioactive so nobody comes close to them. But these tactics are no longer holding the day. They're no longer actually are something that you can be sustainable. More importantly, the major national Zionist Jewish organizations, the ADL, the AJC, AIPAC, Zionist Organization of America, they're on the wrong side of history. They're on the wrong side of history in relation to Black Lives Matter. So instead of actually coming forth and understanding and saying that we're dealing with Black anti-Black racism, that we're seeing the police violence, we're seeing this, they actually were up in arms that the Black Lives Matter movement in their platform have criticized and expressed solidarity with the Palestinians. And therefore they now begin to have a whole campaign to demonize Black Lives Matter. And the whole discourse becomes, rather than addressing the fundamental issues, anti-Black racism, you begin to actually demonize those who have been historically demonized. Now, let me say that this strategy that you pursued have discredited you from having any type of notions of being within the progressive movement or liberal movement. More importantly, the ADL has been in the forefront of sending police officers to be trained in Israel, because that training is not only about training the police in tactics, but it's actually about creating this relationship. It is actually normalizing Israel at the local level. It is also facilitating the intelligence sharing information between the local police on the one hand and various segments of the local domestic links to Israeli intelligence, which is something that we very much have the evidence for in relations to the ADL and its use of paid informants to infiltrate progressive organizations in the Bay Area, and also having a relationship with the local police, San Francisco Police Department, and running some of these data in order to have developed files on activists, individuals, and organization. Not only that, that information also, they dug information on South Africa anti-apartheid activists who were in exile, Irish activists who were there, and exchanged that information with the South Africa Apartheid Intelligence Service, as well as the British Intelligence Service. So again, rather than looking at the particular time and point in history and critiquing what is taking place, they opted to protect Israel, Israel's interest, Israel's apartheid, its oppression of the Palestinians, and go after, again, whether it's Linda Sarsour, Black Lives Matter, or any of the organizations that are beginning to say that we need a fundamental transformation, we need to change that away from our racist, structural racism, racism that is built on settler colonialism here domestically, but is also connected to a transnational picture as well. So these are really the issue that I wanted to put in circulation for us to understand that Islamophobia has many dimensionality. And one of the particular dimensionality that are insidious is the silencing that are there. You are brought in as a Muslim, but you are not allowed to speak. And if you speak, your speech has to be regulated, monitored, and in essence, shaped in such a way that you are not actually speaking from your own vantage point. So if we want to be really very clear, we need to take our democratic rights very seriously. We need to not allow for a continued demonization. We need to be able to open our own doors on our own accords and knock on the doors that we want to open, and we should not allow anyone to be the doorkeeper or the gatekeeper for us. No matter who, when, and how that takes place, we need to be very clear in this. I'm very optimistic, even though that I am very critical. I'm very optimistic that Muslim political engagement, social engagement, complex relations that are being forged across various elements of society is something that's going to bear fruit. And I know that Daniel Pipes, the Emersons, the Frank Gaffney, the Pamela Geller, and their allies with the AJC, the ADL, because there is a soft aspects of what you call sophisticated Islamophobia with the organizational, and then there's the sharp edge, but they feed into each other. All of this, despite of all their demonization work, I do believe that the Muslims will make their imprint and they will make their impact on the society, and we will continue to be in places where we want to be and to express our own voices in our own words and the issues that we care about. So I do care about PDS. I'll advocate for PDS. Again, if you don't like it, that's your problem. I am not a problem solver for settler colonial discomfort. If you have discomfort, you need to find your own therapist to deal with your discomfort. Settler colonialism has to be challenged. PDS is an issue that we will advocate for, we'll rally around, we'll continue to build. We're going to challenge any aspects of continued use of various aspects of our civil society to make Israel akin to our own society. I'm sorry, you're dealing with an apartheid state that practices discrimination, that practices difference. There's a different value that is placed on a Palestinian versus a Zionist Jewish person in a state. That runs contrary to the ethical, moral values, and will continue to speak and advocate on its basis. So thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll have another encounter to continue this rich conversation, and look forward to your continued engagement. And feel free to share this talk. I will post it both on Facebook and YouTube. Tomorrow we will be at 6 p.m. If you can join us, we'll have a conversation with Professor Ramon Grasfugel. Really, it's going to be a very rich discussion with Ramon that touches on power, decolonization, the impact of 1492 on the history of the world, knowledge production, and how knowledge production is in its Eurocentricity, and what impacts that has, and how to navigate really, if we think about decolonization, how to navigate it and what does it mean. So it'll be a rich conversation, and look forward for you tomorrow at 6 p.m. We will be together, and it will be both on Facebook as well as on YouTube. Okay, Assalamu alaikum.